computer. So that's there. And Greg, oh, there you are. You want to go ahead and hop into the space news, and then we'll turn it over to Andrea to go over.
So, yeah,
I do.
They can see.
This is the one time they get a better experience.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you guys get a better experience than the people here. Well, actually, this doesn't do me any good. Oh, it still works with this, right? All right. Yeah, that's gonna be fun. Well, actually, yeah, it's too bad you spend all that time putting the pictures together to look nice. Yeah, that's life. Okay, so monthly space news covering roughly the last month, obviously from the name. Kind of ironic here that I'm the guy talking about space news, and yet we have our guest speaker, Andrea, coming up, does this for a living and gets paid for it. So this is a little different. I won't cover all the news. We're going to leave some for her, in particular the media event that SpaceX had down in Boca Chica. She'll talk about that. She obviously is famous enough as a reporter that they allowed her to ask one of the questions. You know, there weren't that many questions being asked. So that was the good news. The bad news was Elon Musk's response was he zoned out. Could you repeat the question? It was a really long question, which of course brings up all kinds of jokes, that people are bound to think about. The one where the woman complains that her husband just never listens to anything she says. He says, well, that's an odd way to start a conversation. So anyway, Elon Musk also apologized for dad jokes. So we'll let it go with that. Okay, so anyway, on to the space news here. We'll start off with the status update. We've been talking about the James Webb Space Telescope quite a bit. And the good news is that really all is working. All the parts have been fully deployed. Yeah, this is really interesting again. It's out there. It's in the halo orbit around the Lagrange point, which is on the far side of, if you draw an axis from the sun through the Earth, you go out far enough, there's one spot where you can rotate in the shadow on the Earth all the time. It's there circling around that point. It's in a 6-month orbit around the Lagrange point. And that all worked. All the parts are deployed properly. They are starting the calibration of all those mirrors. And this is a long, very lengthy process. You have 18 primary mirrors. Each one has to be individually calibrated to microscopic accuracy. So they're working on that. And that'll be going on for the next 4 or 5 months. You may see some occasional pictures coming out. I think they've had some, but they don't look like much of anything because they're mainly just doing calibration at this point. The spacecraft itself is still cooling down. When I put together these slides, which you can't see, when I put those together, that was down to minus 347, kind of an average kind of temperature. And they have to get down to 390 for most of this to work. It is an infrared telescope, so if they're going to detect heat signatures from the rest of the universe, it has to be pretty cold to be able to do that, getting down to 390. And it's on the way. Yeah, it's all radiation, so it just takes a long time. Now, they have a lot of radiators, but still, it just takes a long time. The good news was that originally they were worried, how long will the fuel last? You need fuel to maintain station. Although you're in a roughly stable orbit, it still takes some amount of fuel to maintain that orbit. There's enough left, probably the last 20 years, which is more than needless to say, everybody's pretty happy. But of course, we'll really be happy when we start to see the real images. Okay, now that was the good news. Now there was some bad news. Space weather. Remember we talked about the solar observatory that NASA had sent up last month. We talked about that. Space weather matters. As the
David just suggested something. You can join online with your phone and see the slides there. You wanted to see the slides. So that is an option.
Well, I can hold it up like this. That's a good point. Yeah, you might want to do that.
Just sign on no audio.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, like this slide we're talking about here, space weather matters. The background of that is the Aurora Borealis, which is actually a symptom of what happened. What happened was SpaceX launched their normal batch now is 49 satellites. They set up a batch of 49 satellites on February 3rd, and they just started deploying them. Now they deploy them to a low orbit, about 130 miles, and they have to work their way up on their own then, using their own ion engines. They go up to 340 miles by the time they get to. That actually takes a couple of months. And they do that for a couple of reasons. The biggest reason is you don't need the, your big rocket that gets you up there. You can carry more stuff to that altitude. And the reason that SpaceX is also now touting pretty highly is that this is actually kind of a safety feature for orbits, that if a satellite fails, doesn't deploy properly, that's a high risk point when you first deploy. Any number of things can go wrong. If that happens, you're in a low enough orbit, there's a lot of drag, and basically it'll come down in a couple of weeks anyway. So it is kind of a nice safety feature that they have. So that's the background on this. They launched that. However, a couple of days before that, there was a big solar, well, not even a big solar, a level 2 solar flare that came out on January 30th. And so this, of course, travels at the speed of light. You could see it. So we could predict that by February 2nd, they would hit Earth. And that was known, and it was announced. But I guess they underestimated the effect it would have. So what happens is when this is basically just charged particles coming out of the sun, they hit the Earth's magnetic field, and it ends up interacting with it, and the energy from that ends up getting dumped into the atmosphere, upper atmosphere. And that's what you see. The aurora borealis is the visible indication of that. It's called the geomagnetic storm. And there's several effects of that. Because of that energy getting dumped into the upper atmosphere, it heats it up. So the higher temperature goes up. But what really mattered was that the atmospheric density goes up. Think ideal gas law, if you will. Essentially, the atmosphere gets a little bit bigger and a little bit denser as a result of that. Turned out that increased the drag by 50% on the aerodynamic drag. 50%, that's what they said. So it's huge. You go from just a couple of particles of air to maybe 4 or whatever. It really slows you down. So they realized that. At that point they were saying, "Oh, maybe we made a mistake here." But they put it in what they call the safe mode. Now, they haven't really defined the safe mode all that well, but the key part of it is that you have to fly edge on. So if the satellite is going this way, if you think about those satellites, they're normal satellites, but they have this huge solar array that sticks up. It's one-sided in the case of the Starlink satellites. You can think of that as a giant parachute, if you will. It's really something to slow you down. So you want to orient that thing. You're moving kind of like a knife, or think of a piece of paper slicing through the atmosphere as thin as possible. And the hope was they could just ride out the storm and then go back to normal operation. Well, it turned out, the storm lasted a little bit longer and the density was a little higher than expected. And that didn't do the job. Now, there's several other problems that they didn't really talk about very much, but I think these probably contributed to it. One is that when you're in that safe mode, probably you're not getting the maximum power out of your solar cells. You're focusing on slicing through the atmosphere. That might not be the ideal angle for capturing sunlight. And the other thing is that the ion engine may not be pointing in the right direction either, at least not for optimal operation. Now, they didn't go into those details, but you have to think some of that happened. The net result was they're up there in the safe mode for too long and they couldn't recover from it. So out of those 49 satellites, 40 of them are vaporized, or at least they're in the process of vaporizing the upper atmosphere right now. So they lost them. But of course, in the big picture, they're launching satellites every couple of weeks. You consider, okay, it's not that big a deal for SpaceX. But still, it's a significant amount of money that went into that. Don't know. What distinguished the ones that made it from the ones that don't? I don't know. I haven't seen it. That's a good question, but I don't know. They're what?
For the drag, they were higher elevation.
Oh, maybe that's it. Yeah. Now it turned out this really only affected SpaceX because they're the only ones that happen to have had a launch recently down at that low of an orbit. Everything else is up higher. They're really unaffected. This is strictly an atmospheric density problem, not an electrical storm problem. Now, the thing is, that is also a possibility in the future. We do have to worry about that. You get the bigger storms, and they can knock out the electrical grid. They can fry the electronics and satellites. It's happened in the past. Actually, the early telegraph system in the 19th century was taken out by a solar flare, as it turned out. Just fried it. The province of Quebec had an outage for the whole province at one point because of solar flares. So that can happen. That's a different problem. Those are with the more intense solar flares, and you end up with electrical problems in that case. So how often do these things happen? Well, during the entire 11-year solar cycle, you get a storm like the one we had just the other day, maybe 1,700 times. So it's actually pretty often. The worst case ones are maybe only 4 times in a cycle. So those are coming. Now, the thing is, there is an 11-year solar cycle that coincides with the sunspot cycle. When you have more sunspots, that's when you're having more and more of these flares. And the peak will come in 2025. Also, if you want to go see the aurora borealis, you want to do it in 2025 for the same reason. So people are going to probably start worrying more about space movement. We've put an awful lot of satellites up lately. Luckily, the ones in low Earth orbit are usually fairly well protected by the magnetic field. The ones that are up higher, they have more of a problem. Okay, moving on. Ongoing testing. There's, made kind of a big thrust for cleaning up space debris. Everybody's worrying about it more and more. And actually, the Chinese put up a satellite which did a good thing. They grabbed a satellite. This is up in geosynchronous orbit. The high one is 22,000 miles. They grabbed that satellite. It was a defunct one. It was one of their own. And they took it up to a higher orbit. Normally the ones that are up in a high orbit like that, you take them up even higher, get them out of the way. It would take way too much energy to actually lower them and get them into the atmosphere. Unlike the low Earth orbit satellites where you dump them into the atmosphere. So they did that. They came up, somehow they grabbed it, they moved it up to a higher orbit, they left it there and they came back. So that demonstrated a capability that actually they hadn't really demonstrated. It showed that they could, approach it, well, find the satellite, approach it, grab it, move it, and come back. Now, of course, unfortunately, that also is exactly the same capability you need for space wars. If you want to grab some enemy satellite, meaning not your own, you do exactly the same thing. So, unfortunately, all of these space debris cleanup things, most of those come with, also saying you have the ability to take out enemy satellites. How they actually did the grabbing is not known. The Chinese did not provide any details on this at all. People have tried looking for clues. One clue is in the mission patch, just like we do with all of our missions. You make up a little patch you can put on your jacket, and they had one for their mission with a full, all of their missions have ties back to Chinese folklore. In this particular one, there's a guy who would go out and fight demons and this and that, and he would always have a spear, and he had an eye in the middle of his head that he could shoot out a ray, kind of like this. And he also, in the picture you can't see, they also had a net showing. So they might have used any of these techniques. They might have used a net. They might have used a robotic arm. They've demonstrated in space shows some robotic arms attached to satellites. We don't know. You may laugh at the idea of using a spear, but actually that's what the American equivalent satellites from Northrop Grumman do. We talked about them last year, the MEV, mission extension vehicles, where we went up to a satellite, an Intelsat satellite, that was running, and it was out of fuel, so it couldn't be used, it couldn't reliably be used anymore because it didn't have fuel. But actually, electronics worked fine, so we grabbed that. And what we do is we actually went up next to it, stuck a spear into the thruster to grab a hold of it, and then just moved it. Now they're doing the station keeping the orbit adjustments to keep them going. So any of those things are possible. Now there's a company called Astroscale. It's a Japanese company, but they're really all over the world. They are doing experiments for testing as well of getting rid of the debris. And they're mostly at low Earth orbit. And they stopped their test, which is sort of disappointing. I'll show you on the slide. Their plan was their very first project. They sent up a satellite, and they also were attached to that. They kept one that was kind of a target representing, what would be debris. And so the very first test, they just moved it off a couple centimeters, and then they grabbed it to show they could do it. That's the first step. Not much, but that's what they did. The second, I did that back in August. Now, this time, they were doing they were hoping to send it off some 10, 20 meters away and do the same thing, go and catch it. They said something anomalous happened. They didn't say what, but basically the experiment is paused till they figure out what to do. So they have a long way to go. Because what they really have to do in the future is show what happens if the thing they're going for is tumbling a little bit. How do you grab it? And that's harder. And then what if you have to approach it? If it's tumbling, you have to, while it's spinning, you try to match its rotation speed, and then you try to grab onto it. Because their technology, what they do is they assume that you have cooperated ahead of time and put a magnetic disk and some pattern recognition patch on your satellite so you can easily recognize where it is and grab a hold of it. So theirs, you might say, theirs is one of the few space debris cleanup systems that really wouldn't be used as a weapon. You wouldn't put one of those magnetic devices on a satellite you were going to use for warfare. But anyway, it's disappointing that their progress is halted. You also have to wonder, why did they do nothing since last August? I mean, the first test they did was pretty simple, 2 centimeters and back. Why did it take them this long? You have to think that maybe they hadn't really worked out all the details in any case. Okay, moving on. Sort of this space Cold War that goes on. As we saw with the Chinese satellite, they're kind of demonstrating that they can do stuff that we can do, which could harm you in space. We actually the US kind of instigated something. They had launched a couple of satellites, the Chinese had launched a couple of satellites up in geosynchronous orbit. And one of the US 5 satellites made a point to move in very, very close to it to take pictures. And this has been going on for quite a while, but everybody's doing that. But the Chinese, in this case, showed that they saw it coming and they moved out of the way. Just the fact that they did that indicates capability that we didn't really know they had. Actually, the Russians and the Chinese the Russians and the French actually have done this for a while along with the US. Now they've shown that they could do that too. The first time that kind of activity going on was publicly announced was back in early 2020. There were a couple of Russian satellites that were tailgating an American satellite, and we actually announced it. But it was actually going on long before that. Anyway, the way to think about it is what's going on now is it's sort of like the old Cold War, especially against the way it was against the Russians, where submarines come and they come and practically bump into each other. The Russian jets would still do buzz American ships to sort of shake them up a little bit. That's going on in space more and more now. Okay, moving on to the main topic here, talking about space-based solar power. And this was really brought up because the NSS, the National Space Society, issued a press release supporting and congratulating the Japanese for having a major project for space-based solar power. And this really was a revision of a roadmap that they'd already had. In fact, I took a look at it, and it's almost the same. I think the main difference is the Japanese are really basically committing in a more concrete way, saying they are going to be building something that will transmit power back through space in 2025 as a test from low Earth orbit. And then actually try to put a gigawatt commercial power up there by 2030. And that is new. So the milestones, they always had those, but now it appears to be a rather firm commitment. So an overview of space-based solar power. It actually goes back to science fiction, like a lot of things that are done, for instance, communication satellites were dreamed up by Robert Heinlein. Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, in a short story in 1941, just described power satellites that took in solar power and transmitted with microwaves, transmitted that to other users. They were doing it on various planets in the story. So the idea goes to there. The architecture for space-based solar power really was laid out in 1968 by someone named Peter Glaser. And there's just 3 components to all the space-based power. The first one is just collecting the energy. Usually that means solar cells. It could actually mean a boiler or some kind of heat engine as well, but usually solar cells. And it may involve reflectors as well, just to concentrate the sunlight. The second part is transmitting this power to Earth, which in most cases has been microwaves. Some cases also been lasers. So those are the 2. And then some way to receive this power on Earth or some other location. People have talked about powering satellites or powering settlements on Mars or something the same way. So those are the 3 components. The key innovation really that came in with Glaser was using an antenna called a rectenna. Now this is a portmanteau word, rectenna. It's the word antenna combined with the word rectifier. A rectifier is another way of saying diode in typical devices. It's a device for converting alternating current to direct current. So if something like your household current is alternating current, if you want to convert it to direct current, you'd use a diode. Now, the reason you do that is you have all these different signals coming in. The radio waves are basically alternating current, but they're coming maybe at slightly different frequencies, different times. The easiest way to handle that is just to convert all the DC and then convert it back to alternating current. So that's what they do. Now, this technology is not new. It was actually invented in '64. Everybody in this room is actually familiar with it in a way, because RFID tags, like are commonly used in inventory management. Those RFID tags, they do not have batteries. They just work by the power that's transmitted from the transponder that's looking for them. And then using that power, they transmit something back. You also are familiar with it from your easy tags. If you have an easy tag in your car, you're going down the tollway and it knows where you are. There's no battery in that little sticker that you're putting on your windshield. That's also using what's effectively a rectenna. It's really just a way to get a little bit of power out of the air. By the way, for people that are familiar with the East Coast, they have a different system called Easy Pass, and theirs uses the battery. It's a different technology. Now the difference though, when I talk about a rectenna for solar power, we're talking about something where the units are miles, or you have square miles of territory filled up, with them. Now I have a picture of what that would look like. And if you can't see it, but you basically just have these huge fields, again, think square miles, and the whole thing is basically a whole bunch of little antennas that are about the size of your hand, maybe 5 centimeters. So a dipole antenna, meaning half the total length of that is half the wavelength of the microwaves you're trying to receive. And there's just millions of those, and they're kind of all aggregated together. It's just a huge metal mesh on the ground, really. And that's what you're using to get the power. Now, it's been reconsidered several times in history. Typically what's happened was they look at it, they decide it's too expensive, and they kind of give up for a while. And then they go back and do a retrospective. Like NASA looked at this actually back in the 60s, and then they kind of gave up. They had a fresh look in 97, and then they gave up, and so on. So this goes on in cycles, and we're starting an up cycle on this again. But there's a reason for that. And the biggest thing is the launch costs are coming down drastically. I mean, Falcon 9 alone probably brought down the cost by a factor of 10. Starship will do another factor of 10, maybe 100 in the best case, mainly depending on how often you launch to spread out the fixed cost. So there's the promise anyway of costs getting a lot cheaper, because cost is the main problem with space-based solar power right now. The second thing is, of course, that the solar panels, they're getting better, the weight's coming down and so on. And also, to the extent that you have to have construction of large structures in outer space, robotics is getting better as well. So there's every reason to think that the cost of doing that should come down. The other thing is the designs have gotten better. They're much more modular now. Now they're focusing mostly on plates. You can think like the squares, maybe the size of dinner plates or maybe a little bigger, mass produced, and then essentially being kind of independent. So on one side, they'll have the solar cells to pick up the power. On the other side, they'll have the microwave transmission. And then the stuff in between is the electronics to accomplish that. Basically, converting the light to DC, powering the electronics, generating the microwaves, and so on. So they call it a sandwich in a lot of these architectures. The idea is this is kind of nice because one is if they're independent, that means you don't need to wire them all together. You save a lot of weight just in a copper wire. If we're talking, you're talking about a square kilometer or two of antenna up in space. There's a lot of wire to wire together. You don't need to if each one just transmits independently. The second thing is that you might not even need a huge structure to tie them all together. There's been a lot of different designs for that, but some of them posit essentially have them all kind of orient themselves as they need to without even necessarily being attached to anything, or at least minimizing that. Now, if you do that, that also gets the cost way down. Think of it as a school of fish. Just have a whole bunch of fish all facing the same way, picking up your solar beam on one side and transmitting power out the other. So there are some advantages that are always cited for space-based solar power. The first thing is that, they say the sun never sets in space, and that's sort of true. If you're in a high orbit, you're far enough away from Earth, you're never in the Earth's shadow, or at least, maybe only a few times a year, if you can be in the Earth's shadow at all. So that means the sun is available 24 hours. That's quite different than solar cells on the land where you're limited daytime. Maybe you get 7 or 8 hours of useful sunlight on average. The second advantage is there's no atmospheric interference in getting the original power to the solar cells. So they say you're getting at least 30% more sun. And there's a lot of disputes over the exact numbers, but clearly the sun is better in space than it is going to be down here where you have the atmosphere. Right? Of course, it's cited as being clean, no carbon once it's up and running. Now that's kind of one of the catches is that first you have to get it up and running. It takes a lot of fuel to transport all that stuff up there. So it's not really totally free, but at least it is, certainly once it's running, it doesn't take much in the way of carbon-based power. That also is kind of ignoring maintenance as well. Ultimately, when things break, you know, you're going to leave as much in place as you can, but at some point, you're probably going to be doing maintenance. Now, another interesting area is that this power can be redirected. So if you have solar satellites in a lower orbit, you know, then they actually are blocked by the sun partially. But you could have, you know, at different times, you could direct the power to one place or another. And so that's cited, maybe military use, maybe disaster relief, that kind of thing. Now, longer term, the assumption is that we won't have to lift all this stuff off of Earth. Longer term, we would probably want to mine the material off the moon, do the processing. There's plenty of elements on the moon to create solar cells, but it's obviously you have to set up the manufacturing operation. So it's kind of a bootstrapping problem. You're not going to start off with that. You're going to start off with things brought up from Earth. But eventually, the hope would be you could lower costs fairly drastically by doing a lot more off of Earth. And there's no pollution on Earth from it either. But there's barriers. You know, why don't we see it yet? Well, the first thing is just cost. That's always been the problem. It's maybe 10 times, maybe 100 times more expensive than Earth-based power. The launch and the maintenance costs are the biggest killers right there, launch in particular. It's always going to be more expensive to take a solar cell, you know, and throw it up way up in the atmosphere as opposed to just installing it on the ground. You can't beat that. The space conditions are a lot more severe. In a high orbit in particular, the radiation's a lot higher. The panels may degrade maybe 8 times faster, is a figure commonly cited. And also, if you're going to have people involved in creating it, then they're exposed to more radiation at high orbits as well. So that's all kind of a problem. Even if you have robots doing it, robots depend on a lot of electronics, you know, computing power to be effective. They are also quite vulnerable to that radiation. So that's a problem. The big issue also is scale. There is no such thing as a small solar-based system. And part of the problem is to transmit efficiently. Well, if you're using microwaves, the big problem there is that you're going to send it down to Earth. You can't have it be a very concentrated beam. You're going to fry everything in between. You know, birds, people, you know, whatever. And it's kind of hard to do that, especially from my orbit. Even just the satellites in between are going to get affected. So that's an issue. The other thing is the microwave beams themselves, they spread out. So the typical solution is going to be assume maybe a kilometer wide array out in space. You need a 10-kilometer receiving area to handle that. So it's got to be big. You just can't avoid that. Unless you're using laser power, and then you have the opposite problem. You've got this really concentrated beam, and it would destroy anything. You know, if the beam drifted off, you know, it's a weapon. It's not a practical power source. So there are some risks, collisions, space debris, all that kind of stuff. Interference with communications. You know, they're using microwaves. Microwaves are pretty much at the same frequency as a lot of the communications that go on. So there's a lot of use of those frequencies. Damage, of course, and they're vulnerable. You know, war, terrorism, those kinds of things. Technology issues. The atmosphere would absorb a lot of the power if you go to a higher frequency. You're restricted to maybe maximum 10 gigahertz in the frequencies you can use. There are a lot of losses in the overall process. When you transmit through the atmosphere, you're going to lose some power. You think about the whole process. You're starting off with light from the sun. It gets converted to direct current by the solar cells. It then gets converted back to an alternating current microwave, which is transmitted. It's received, it's converted to DC, then it's converted back to alternating current. There's a lot of steps in there. And anytime you have a conversion step, there's inefficiency. So that's part of the problem. So yeah, there's some other things that go on. Heat dissipation turns out to be an issue. Solar cells are not 100% efficient. You have a lot of them up there. What happens to the energy that doesn't get transmitted? Well, it has to be dissipated as heat. And as Doug had mentioned, it's hard to dissipate heat in space. You can only radiate it away. So that gets to be a problem in its own right. Anyway, there's been a lot of arguments about this. So the proof will simply be, if people build it and it works, they'll have a last laugh. Elon Musk has taken a very strong opinion on this, as he has on most other things. He was interviewed in 2012 in one of these public relations things that like the one that Andrew's going to talk about. He said, space-based solar power is the stupidest thing ever. That was literally what he said. And then there was a follow-up. He had an interview with, I think it was Popular Account, and he actually said, stab that bloody thing in the heart. I mean, that's kind of his opinion. Now he has, of course, he has his own biases in that. I mean, he does, after all, have a company, Tesla, that makes solar panels and makes batteries, to ride you through the night when there's no solar power. So you might say, okay, he has a vested interest in not having this happen. On the other hand, of course, if you're putting up solar power satellites, that's a tremendous amount of business for his rocket company. So he has a little bit to balance there. Now, looking at it economically from his standpoint, he's seeing that there's a much bigger business in communication satellites than there is in launch business. So he's probably still leaning toward, let's not do this space-based solar power. Just the fact that he's totally against it, makes you think twice anyway. Anyway, there are other projects besides this Japanese one that I was talking about. We talked about NASA having a various number of these projects, and they go up and they go down, but nothing has really come of it. The Naval Research Lab did an orbital test. The X-37B, that space plane we talked about before, they actually took one up. They had a solar panel on the outside with the electronics to transmit the microwaves. They didn't transmit all the way back to Earth. They were just trying to measure how well it would hold up and how well it would convert the power to microwaves, and then how would it do over a long period of time. I mean, that thing was up there like a year and a half or so. So they found that out. There was some information that came out about it. They considered it a success. The Air Force has actually put up a $100 million contract for Northrop Grumman, who's going to do some satellite testing in 2024. Now they say they're looking for power to forward military bases. That one you have to kind of take with a grain of salt. I mean, it's hard to imagine them carrying, a 10 kilometer pile of metal, and putting that all around their military base out there in the middle of some forward base. So maybe they're looking at it with lasers, and maybe they're also getting kind of a dual use out of that. Caltech has a program that's gone on for a while. They had a backer that also provided $100 million. This is just a private person, and they expect to actually launch something by 2023 to test this out. The UK may do a system. China's the big unknown. They have said they want to do this too, and they're saying they'll have small scale low Earth orbit tests in 2025, and they're hoping to have a megawatt size reactor up by 2030. We don't know, of course, how these will turn out, but anyway, there's definitely a lot of interest out there. It may or may not happen. Okay, quick thing on launches since the last meeting. We normally do a survey. We're kind of short on time here. Let's not even bother with that. Turns out that since the last meeting, which was January 8th, a little bit more than a month, there were 11 launches, and I'll just highlight a couple of those. One of them is on a Falcon 9. They took up, there's a project where they have a series called Transporter, where they pick up a lot of small satellites. And in this case, they took up 105. And this is really how SpaceX is competing against the smaller rocket vendors. So those guys are kind of afraid of these things. There will be another one of these because they are successful and they're a lot cheaper than the ones from, say, Rocket Lab or some of the others. Virgin Orbit put up one, or they put up 7 small satellites. They're the ones that dropped the rocket out of the plane, not to be confused with Virgin Galactic that does the space tours. I can skip through the rest. OneWeb, this is the competition for Starlink, this for internet service from space. They're up to 428 satellites now. They kind of been, you don't get much press. Everybody hears about Starlink. Nobody hears much about their competition. They're up there. They're planning on having 648 satellites. They're up to 428 now. Now, Starlink has over 2,000, even after losing. They still have more than 2,000 that are up there. But they have to have more because they're in lower orbit. So they can't cover as much territory with each satellite. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. So at that point, discussion, questions, comments?
I saw the astronaut location there.
Yeah.
Do you have any information or follow-up information?
All I know is that it was the upper stage that failed, and I don't really recall why. Yeah, it's sad for them that out of the last 4 attempts, they had 1 successful launch, I think, and then the other 3 have all failed. And usually it's been the upper stages. It's kind of funny when I made the slides, the last 2 elements of OneWeb satellite launch and Astro rocket failure was exactly the same position the last 2 launches from last time. So it was easy to update. Yeah.
You know what the Chinese are doing on the moon?
What they're doing at the moment?
What they're doing.
Well, they thought, yeah, they did everything they want to do. So, you know, they've got explorers out there. They really know what he's doing. It's their sort of survey.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what it is. Oh, yeah. They can argue that going. And of course, all that is still something speculative until it's actually built, you know, fusion reactor that works yet. So, but I think what that will change everything. There's no question about it. So that's one of those things where I think everybody has a lot of irons in the fire. Whatever technologies end up working, then obviously, you know, the investment will follow that. So, yeah.
Oh, well, this kind of goes hand in hand with the fact that helium-3 is a fuel for a fusion reactor, which people say, oh yeah, that's going to be 20 years in the future. Always. But the Chinese also announced that they had a breakthrough on their EAST, experimental something scale tokamak, advanced, yeah, something scientific tokamak. So that's their fusion reactor. So they set a record for test duration. It was real long. It was like a minute or something. I don't know. It was 17 minutes. It was yeah. 100 million degrees. Yeah, and that's like phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's incredibly hot and for a phenomenally long time. We weren't supposed to get there for about 20 years. But now they have the tokamak that is clearly very progressive, farther progressive than the Americans or the American European Consortium, the jet Taurus reactor in Europe. And I really think that this is something that we should be paying, our government or somebody should be paying more attention to. These guys are on the fast track, it seems to me. They got, and now they're going out to the fuel.
That's true in a lot of things, in fact.
Problem with ours versus Chinese. United States, all the nuclear energy is governed by the government. Private enterprise is not going to get access to, you know, commercial nuclear reactors for a long time. You know, up to 20 years or more. And the reason we're looking into, so many companies looking into the solar options, they realized recently after doing the numbers on Mars that everybody was thinking solar power was going to be for the sun on Mars. There's not enough energy to spaghetti.
So I think everybody assumes you're going to have at least fission reactors on
We're going
Mars.
to have, well, proper engineering solution would have 2 or 3 solutions go at the same time. So if one fails, you've got backups. So if you got solar power, that's not your primary. So everybody's looking at another primary source there. And nuclear is supposed to be a primary source, now it's not available. So you have to look at other sources. And right now I'm using methane to generate electricity, like a boiler or sorry. A lot of our power plants generating coal use boilers, like a it's a boiler.
Steam boiler, yeah, steam boiler.
Not just steam boiler whole technology, but if we can develop it and use it for methane and liquid oxygen on Mars, like as a primary reactor, that would be our primary source of energy. The reason for that, all of our power sources in the world right now, most of them, 8% or 9% of them, are boilers. Use coal or propane or some source. And the thing is, if we can use that technology, I looked it up, and Siemens has got some small boilers that fit in the space station spaceship. Now they're packaged, already ready to go, the 2, 3 of them in one spaceship. And the idea is you put boilers on Mars, they work with methane.
The big thing is you got to create the methane in the first place, which is
right. So what I'm getting at is everybody's trying to develop a primary source of energy, a power source. other than solar. Solar is a secondary backup of batteries. But you need a different power source in space. And with nuclear being so far off, we're looking at other, everybody's looking at other options.
Yeah. Well, fission is still probably the primary assumption along with solar in between those
It
two.
can be
Fission
taken
exists
as
now.
well.
It works fine. So.
From a Mars standpoint, with SpaceX and other companies, well, you're going to see private enterprise on Mars before our government is on Mars. On Moon,
Maybe.
Moon is going to be a governmental deal. The Chinese being first, and that's right behind the problem. But the deal is, you know, private enterprise is going to Mars, and it's not going to be able to do the reactor because it's too regulated. Right
Just
now,
one final note about the Chinese versus American efforts. The Chinese ran that reactor at how hot? 130 degrees. That's what I thought. 130 degrees for 17 minutes. Just this week or last week, how that I think it was announced that they had run their tokamaks for a record-setting 5 seconds, and they got up to 20 million degrees, and then this is like opening up the future and all this is like, oh man, this is not any. They're 1/5. They're running at 1/5 the temperature that the Chinese ran there, and they're running for 5 seconds versus 17 minutes, a whole lot less time.
We can always work with the Chinese.
We never know really what's Chinese are doing, but it's true with it. According to public announcements, yeah, that's what's happened. I saw.
Now, a bigger problem in power space, especially the problem of oilers, machines, steam turbines. We can't lift that kind of power. You can't. So the big problem is that a lot of people with gaseous drives or a lot of people hydrogen powered drives that generating that power. Even if the solar cells alone, forget it. Right? If you look at something like the solar panel, not being that. Even with a steam boiler and steam turbine, you need 150 to 200 tons on the power engineer. You can't lift up the largest rocket we have on the So now people have to come around and say, okay, how do I miniaturize this? Miniaturize a nuclear power plant, thorium reaction force now, a lot safer than uranium, or something in that on that order of magnitude. Rolls-Royce, for example, is coming out with miniaturized nuclear reactor, maybe a variant of that. But they have to bring it down to something that weighs only a few.
Well, the fission plants that run into your solar. They can be wrong. That's still kind of. I think we need to invite it because we have a guest speaker that came all this way.
It's more than
Are there? Does it work in the submarines?
yeah, because
I guess I don't care about
the
wind
nuclear
turbines.
reactor, steam turbine, you have the auxiliary equipment, you have the emission, you have to carry water, feed water, and a ton of stuff you will do.
All right, so Andrea, we've already pretty much introduced her already. She covers technology and space in particular from the Houston Chronicle. I have some things on the slide here showing, you know, you see her, she was, you know, her story is on the front section of the paper today. Anyway, let's just turn it over. Yeah, because the remote users could see them. So.
I've got cheat sheets, so apologize. And I'm not an engineer, so I'm going to go ahead and preface with that. And is there video here, or are they just looking at the slide?
They're just looking at the. Oh no, they can see you through the camera.
Okay.
Here.
Okay, there we go.
And I can move this.
All right, I'm a pretty loud talker, but can everyone in the back hear me okay? Okay, everyone on camera, hear me okay? I don't see that anymore. All right, thank you. So yeah, I just titled mine Covering Space in 2022 because this is a really fun time to be covering space. Like I started this beat at a really fascinating time because there's just so much happening right now. So a little bit about me. My name is Andrea. I born in Orlando, Florida, so I was spoiled. We actually watched the shuttle go up from our front yard, which was, you know, you just kind of take it for granted as a kid. And then when it stops, you're like, what happened? So, and that was really fun. I went to University of Florida for journalism. My first job out of school was at Fort Myers, Florida, just like a small little town. I did a lot of business reporting for years. I've been in Houston since 2014, and I did business reporting up until 2020, which was a great year to start with the commercial crew program and Bob and Doug's flight. So space is getting really busy right now. Like, it's just so busy. And every time you watch a launch, you're like, oh, here's a launch. And then it's like, oh, there's another one. And like the Astro rockets, right? You have this on in the background as I'm working. I'm like, is it going to make it? Is it going to make it? My favorite's like, oh, that Aussie company's launch that went sideways. What's the name of that company? Thank you. Firefly's launch. It's like, oh, come on, Firefly. And so it's just, it's always fascinating. You never know what you're going to see with these rocket launches. But yeah, so I took the B in 2020, and the first thing I got to do was go to Florida for the commercial crew program, which we launched Bob and Doug into space, and that was just really cool to finally get to see, you know, humans going back into space again. And then, I mean, it's just been nonstop since then. You know, a lot of local companies are doing really fun things too. NanoRacks, I've had the pleasure of following them for years, and they let me in there to kind of document what it's like to pack up the airlocks. I watch them as they're all in their white, clean room, and they're all wrapping in this bright pink bubble wrap, and they're like loading it in this U-Haul, and this guy's standing in there. He's like, okay, lock me in the U-Haul so I can make sure it's not going to hit the roof when it's going down the road. So like, you're locking your boss in the U-Haul. And it's just like, you're watching these moments, which is just really cool to kind of see what it's like here in Houston before it goes to the launch pad, before it gets to space. Intuitive Machines is another really fun local company because, you know, they're building a lander, and they do all their testing at Ellington Airport. And so they like to drive a truck out there, light up the engine for their lander, and they let me come out and watch it once. You know, it's just, okay, well, that thing's going to work on the moon in a couple of years, and they're testing the iterations there. I think it's been pushed back now to the end of this year, but it's like, okay, so there's just so much fun stuff going on here in Houston as well. But there's just, yeah, there's been a lot going on. Oh, sorry, that was a Space Game Business Line. I'm a little slow on that one. So one of the big articles I did is just like, everything's bigger in Texas. For those of you who can see the slide, we have obviously two of the world's richest men launching rockets in Texas. We got Bezos in West Texas, and we got Elon Musk in South Texas. And so last year I got to do a big program where I kind of looked at like, what's it like when a billionaire chooses your backyard to launch rockets? Like, what's it like? You're going about your business, and one day, all of a sudden, Jeff Bezos comes into like the weekly newspaper and goes, I'm going to give you my exclusive. I am launching rockets in your backyard. No one, not the AP, not the New York Times, got an interview with Bezos. They all had to cite this weekly newspaper in Van Horn, Texas. And so it was really cool because I met that guy, and he like pulled out his clip, and he's holding up all proud, like he got the exclusive. And I'm like, oh, that's so cool of you to do. And then, you know, in South Texas, it's a little more controversial, but for those of you who can see this, I love this. This was a Ellis Design. Ellis is our graphic artist. He does all the drawings. If you can see, Elon Musk's toe is over the line because he doesn't really like rules. He's like edging the toe a little bit. And if you look up close at Bezos' face, he's got the Amazon smile in there. So he's got a couple of Easter eggs hidden in those. So this was the most rewarding, probably most exhausting project I've done. So I've been slowly pulling at it for a long time. And then my editor's like, oh, Bezos is going to space. We want 3 weeks of travel because we want to get this all done before he goes to space, because once he goes to space, people aren't going to care anymore. So all of a sudden it's like a light of fire. I was in Brownsville for a week, and then I had a week off, and I was in Van Horn for a week, and then I had a week off, and then it was the launch. And so it was just really crazy. And they're totally different environments. So this one is the mural in South Texas, because, you know, we've got to have murals of our billionaires in both cities. That one is in Van Horn. But so South Texas is really interesting because Elon Musk is a very polarizing figure. You know, you've got like the fanboys and girls, and they are 24/7 on the side of highway, videoing, taking pictures, constantly watching what SpaceX is doing out there. And it's really cool because you're down there. They're like, oh yeah, I just picked up and moved here from XYZ and this is my life now. Like you moved to Brownsville to document SpaceX. And it's so cool to meet these people. But then you've got the environmentalists. And so I followed around one woman who tracks bird nests. And you know, there are fewer bird nests of all the activity that's going on. And like the environment out there is pretty sensitive. She said like they're mud flats. And so once you like damage it, you know, with heavy tractors, even just blueprints, they stay forever, or not forever, but for a really long time. And so they're concerned about like the shorebirds. I think they're piping plover pipers. They're like these itty bitty shorebirds that are like all migrate there. And so they've got a lot of those concerns. But then we talked to the food truck people because there is, who's been down there to South Texas? Who's seen the Starship? Okay. It is 40 minutes from Brownsville, and you drive half an hour down this road where there's just nothing. There's no bathrooms, there's no food, there is no infrastructure besides like a couple small homes on the beach. So Elon Musk had to have food trucks come out there to feed people. And so like I finally got hold of some of these food trucks, and their business just tripled because all they do is they go out there and they feed SpaceX and you know all these employees, and local restaurants like have open extra locations because they needed to feed SpaceX employees. And so there's just been this big boom. We've had like carpenters and welders and people who used to work in the oil rigs have come back home because they can work for SpaceX. And now they can be closer to family in Brownsville. So you've got like all these different ways that he's affecting people there. And then have you guys heard about the Boca Chica Village, that community right there? There's like this 2 rows. It's like literally 2 streets of houses. And they're like mostly built in the 1950s or 60s. They're older houses. They have to have water delivered because they're not hooked up to any sewage. Like they have like septic tanks and stuff, but they have big tanks that hold water out front. And a lot of people live there because they can walk to the water and it's close to the beach. And, you know, it's just very quiet. Well, all of a sudden, now you've got 24/7 rocket engine being built in your backyard. And every time there's a test, they have to, Elon Musk pays for them to go to South Padre and stay for a few nights. And, you know, the road's always closed. That's kind of a big point of contention. So it's just really interesting to go to South Texas because you talk to the officials and they're like, this is great for education. It's great for jobs. You know, you talk to the locals and like half of them are trying to get this Elon spottings and the other half are like, yeah, you know, it's a little aggressive, but we're not so sure about it. So it's just, there's a lot more very people who are very excited about it. And then there's a lot of people who are not excited about it. Van Horn, West Texas is very different. So this is 2 hours from El Paso. So like, you know, I was talking to people and they would, you know, plan their Costco trip 2 hours to El Paso back. Like it's just like, that's part of the lifestyle there. It's just a very, very small town, 2,000 people. I am terrible with directions. I had this town down within 2 days. It's like you got, here's I-10, you got like a couple, like 11 streets north of it, 3 streets south of it, and that's all. And so you start talking to them and they're like, Jeff Bezos has been there so long that they couldn't even tell me when he showed up. He's been very quiet. Like he's also like 45 minutes north of the town. So like they know he's there, but it's been very quiet, very hush hush. Anyone who works there signed NDA. So like your friend won't tell you what they're doing out there. And so it's kind of, it was more, they didn't really care that he was there because he'd been there so long and not doing much of anything. And so the vibe was very much like, yeah, I mean, one day we hope that he'll bring something to the town, you know, like one of the issues I wrote about is their water supply. They don't have enough like water towers and pipes and infrastructure to support like their population. So as more and more people move in, that's like a bigger problem. So they're like kind of hoping to get some help, but it was not nearly as controversial as it was in South Texas. So it's just very different, like small town versus like a big border town. It was very cool to see those different environments, but it was interesting. So I've got some stories from both. When I was in South Texas, Elon Musk spends most of his time in Boca Chica Village, which is like those little houses around the rocket. So as my job as a reporter, a lot of times I find myself knocking on doors, okay? So I'm like, knock on a door, no one answers, go to the next door, knock on a door. There's a Tesla tailing me as I go from house to house to house. Knock on the door, huh? Yes, there was. It was not a self-driving Tesla. And if you tried to talk to him, he cracked the window this much. He was not rolled down that window to talk to me. So I was like, yes, can I help you? So he just followed us. I went to each house. And then I finally met the people who lived next door to Elon Musk. They're like original Boca Chica Village. And they're like, oh yeah, Musk lives next door. We tried to wave at him once. He comes out and he goes, oh, back of his house. And he built a big fence around. So it was just very interesting. And, you know, the houses that were bought by SpaceX have been painted gray and black and like very modern colors versus like the original bricks. And when I was in Van Horn, everyone kept telling me about the Tarantula Migration. Apparently in West Texas, there's this Tarantula Migration. I could never get it on the record. I was so mad because this one guy was just talking. He's like, yeah, one day I came out and there was just tarantulas everywhere. And I'm like, okay. So, you know, these like fresh out of, you know, engineering school, early 20s are like, now I've got tarantula migrations and I've got like, there's this one patch of the road that always gets muddied out. This poor guy, I got the best quote was like, which one of my rocket scientists is going to get stuck in the mud pit? Oh yes, it was that one, because like they tried to drive through it. And so it's just, those are the types of stories I was trying to get out of this. It was very cool to be there and just trying to write a big narrative story about what it's like when it's in your backyard. So that was like, I would say that was the most rewarding thing, but most stressful thing I've ever done. Housing there was hard. I actually ended up splitting an Airbnb of CNN, which was really interesting. Because the CNN reporters, you know, of course, get all the questions while the print journalists are there being like, wait, no, okay. So I figure what you all probably want to hear about is the Starship update that happened Thursday. That was very interesting. So a week before, this is kind of how Elon Musk world works. He tweets and then it happens. So he's given out tens of millions of dollars by Twitter. And like when you call people, they're like, oh, yeah, we saw the tweet, but he hasn't approached us. We don't really know how we're getting this $30 million yet. And so he like makes news that way a lot. Well, a week ago, he said, yep, Thursday, 8 p.m., there's going to be a news conference. And he hadn't done one since September 2019. And so sure enough, on Monday, I get the media invite. Okay, sign up for credentials. And then on Wednesday, they're like, okay, great, you've got credentials, get down here. And so myself and a photographer go down there and, you know, you arrive at 6, you check in, they take you out there at 7, and half of the bus is filled with those people who document every day from the side of the road, like, you know, people taking pictures and videos. And so they're like, who wants to go see the rocket? You know, reporters are all grumpy bunches, but half the bus is like, woo, let's go see this rocket. And you're like, oh, well, this is an interesting mix of people. So we get out there, and Elon Musk kind of starts a lot of these presentations the same way. Did you guys watch it? Yeah, okay. You know, he starts with like the big picture Mars thing, which again, as a reporter is like, oh, that's not really newsworthy. I know where you feel about Mars at this point. So you're like waiting and waiting, but you know, he starts with the Mars and he starts talking about the development and stuff. And I think a big kind of complaint was just that he didn't have a ton of new things to say when it came to Starship, especially since he's so vocal on Twitter that a lot of the people who follow the ins and outs knew a lot of it. But it was still interesting just to get his take on the updates and stuff. And so, you know, we learned about the engines and, you know, the Raptor 2 developments coming along. He talked about refilling in space, which I've been schooled as refilling, not refueling. But basically that whole process, I was talking to one of my sources before he started, and he was most concerned about that because like, all right, Elon, we've seen that you can launch rockets. We know you can do that, but we're not getting to the moon without, what is it, 10, 12? He didn't give a number, unfortunately, but like, it's gonna need like 10 launches of Starship to get up there to transfer. 4? Just 4? Or just 4? Okay, I thought it would be higher. So to get a bunch up there to refuel it so that it has enough to land and come back. And so it's just like, that's one of the most complex things that still need to happen. And so, you know, he kind of touched on that. He gave a really high level of everything. And then you got the reporters in there. So I was not special to be chosen to talk to him. I just muscled my way to the microphone. I'm very good at getting my elbows. I was like, I see the microphone, I'm gonna be here. So I was supposed to be third in line, but then like CNBC was literally like dragged in by SpaceX person to put the front of the lines. I don't know what happened there, but the CNBC reporter got like escorted to the front and he gives his comments. And so, you know, we start off with the question and answer and Elon Musk is like, I can't hear anybody. I can't see anybody. What's going on? And so like this poor reporter's like talking to the microphone. She gets her question. And you know, this goes on for a few reporters. And finally it's my turn. And when you're up there, first of all, I'm surrounded by a ton of other reporters I really respect. So I'm like, don't ask a dumb question. Don't ask a dumb question. And then, you know, I had really wanted to know more about Texas versus Florida because Elon Musk is building a launch site in Florida. And, you know, South Texas is very much like, we want to be Boca Chica to Mars. We want to be where you go to Mars. But he had kind of already addressed that 3 times. So I'm like, I'm not going to be the reporter who asks about Texas and Florida again. So I had my other questions going in my head. And meanwhile, this guy is like pushing something toward my feet, like push back, push back. So I'm like, what is happening? He's putting a box at the edge of what's already a stage. And he's like, stand on the box. So I'm like, okay, so I'm clambering on top of this box. I started off, I'm like, hi, my name's Andrea Leinfelder. I'm a reporter at the Houston Chronicle. Light cuts out, so all Elon Musk here is, hi, and this is silence. So Elon Musk is like, hello, great. And so then I go and I repeat my question. I clamber off the box and try and get all the way to the next reporter. And he's up there goes, I'm sorry, I zoned out. Will you repeat your question? I was like mortified. So I clamber back off the box. I'm like, okay, well, let me try and ask my question again. And it was about refueling because my sources had been telling me about that. And unfortunately, he would not say how many. So I'm still waiting on that. But then I got lectured about refilling, not refueling, because it's mostly oxygen. I recently learned, I've covered this a couple times now, but propellant is an oxidizer and a fuel. So basically the fuel is something that needs to be burned, the oxidizer is what burns it. And so liquid oxygen is a popular one, but like the oxidizer is gonna be a bigger problem with fuel in most parts, which is why I got schooled again. It's like, I knew that, but, and then I also asked about just the business case, because I still think it's really interesting. We don't really need a rocket this big for commercial applications yet. And that's something we're still like in the business side trying to figure out, like, yeah, you need it to get things to the moon. So there's NASA as a customer, but NASA's not paying you a ton for this human landing system. You guys are definitely the lowest bidder. And obviously, Starlink is a SpaceX division, so that's your own thing. And then we've got like a couple of wealthy billionaires. How many can there possibly be at some point, right? Like to do the dear moon projects. And so that's what I really hope to answer. I mean, he gave a pretty good one, like hopefully if you build it, they will come kind of thing. But that's something that we're still trying to look at. It's just like, this is going to be huge and it's going to be expensive. And so, we're trying to figure out the business case. So before I move on, did you guys have anything specific you wanted to know about the Starship update? Or I keep going? Because it was just, I didn't feel like there's a ton of news. A lot of you read Eric Berger, his kind of post came out and said the same. And they're like, okay, well, what was newsy? The biggest news to me was the Florida angle, just because South Texas had really, really, really wanted it to be where all the launches happen. I think a lot of them will still happen there, but not all of them. And that's kind of a letdown for the people in Texas. Yeah. Yeah, I could see him, but I was probably about this distance with like 100 people between us. So I was like on a stage. They had like a little tiered stage, and he was like on a stage, probably back window there. And then there's just like standing room only, or shoulder to shoulder people, and everyone in front of me is like a sea of people. And then of course they put the reporters in the back. They're like, anyone want to get close to the rocket? Not the reporters. You stay on that stage. Everyone else can see the rocket. So you're like, okay, all right. But it was cool. It's always cool to like get a chance to see him. And the reason I want to ask the question is because SpaceX is Elon Musk is very talkative on Twitter. SpaceX is very quiet to the media. I will send them emails for every article I do, and they don't even respond. They've got it. They don't respond to a comment. They don't respond to anything. And I used to have a really good rapport with them. Actually, when I was working on that article last year, I kind of felt like the creepy ex-girlfriend, because I was like, I had this guy's number. I text him every week until he told me he wasn't going to participate in the article, because it was like an article he had to be in. And so I had to alert my phone every Tuesday at 1 p.m., call and text a SpaceX guy until he finally told me he wasn't going to talk to me. And so like, it's important to go to these events and like ask a question just so they can like keep me on the radar. And so that's why I want to make sure I was there. But any other Starship questions? No, he's still very much in the engineering stage. Like someone asked him about how he was going to decorate but like, design the interior for passengers. And he just kind of shrugged it off. He's still very much in this many engines, this much mass to orbit, this much, et cetera, et cetera. He didn't talk about the radiation problems or the human problems. I actually saw someone on Twitter who was like, yeah, he always talks about it like mass to orbit, not how we're going to live. I think the closest he did get was just saying how important it's going to be self-sustaining there. Because, obviously, if we miss a trip from Earth to Mars because of some incident, then, whatever's there could die out if we all rely on those deliveries. And so that's like the closest he got to hell keeping people alive. It's just like, it's going to have to be self-sustaining. But he didn't really elaborate on radiation, which I know is a big problem that NASA and everyone else is still trying to tackle. Yeah. They did. We weren't allowed to take pictures of them, but they had like the 2 Raptor engines on the side there. They're huge. They're obviously bigger than me. Yeah. Yeah, they had 2 over there. It was really cool to see them, but I wish they'd do these things in the daylight. Like Elon Musk likes to flare in the nighttime, but like in the daylight, I got out there before they closed the road the next day to try and see Starship stacked in the daylight, because it's so much cooler when you see the sun off of it and stuff, but they didn't have that there.
How many people were there? And who did they represent?
Yeah.
Besides
You know, it's hundreds. I don't know how many. I had one journalist say, I think there's 1,000. I'm really bad at the crowd game, but I would say there were easily hundreds. And there's like a lot of reporters, a lot of social media reporters, and a lot of local officials, because I had a couple people text me with some of my sources, like, oh, I saw you were there too. So they're like, you know, people from Cameron County, people from the city of Brownsville, a lot of SpaceX workers, and just like probably people who know people, because like when we were driving in, they have a restaurant down there and there's like a party happening at the restaurant. So they just had a lot of people out for the event. All right, upcoming mission. So things on my radar, Artemis 1 is obviously the next big thing. I keep hoping, you know, NASA keeps being like, it's gonna be March, and then okay, April or May. And I'm like, I need you to hurry up. My husband and I are actually expecting our first kid in July. So I'm like, if you wait too long, I'm not gonna get on that plane to this launch. So please keep it coming. So the Artemis 1 launch, all right, raise a hand. This is a poll we were taking over the Thursday too. Is it gonna be SpaceX Orbital first or Artemis 1? What do you think, Artemis 1? SpaceX Orbital? Wow, I'm thinking it's Artemis 1, but okay. You think SpaceX will go into orbit first? All right. Well, obviously that's another thing I'm looking forward to. I really want to be out there because he said it's going to have 33 engines, and I just cannot imagine what it's going to feel like. Like sound is one thing, but I just want to feel like the vibrations of 33 engines. So that's next on my list. Starliner. I feel so bad for poor Starliner. I'm just like, Bo, you got to get this through the space. Like every time I write about it, like, okay, you go when you're coming. I'm like, oh. So hopefully Starliner gets into space this year. And on James Webb Space Telescope, we were talking about at the beginning, this summer they should hit their first images. On yesterday, they released images of, it was like the very first star they captured, but it's like 18, the same star 18 different times because they're trying to align it. So I'm waiting for those first images. Those are big on my list of things for this year. So, and then I figure another question I often get is just like, what's it like journalism right now? You know, obviously print is not the latest and greatest industry to be in. So a lot of people ask me, how's print journalism doing and whatnot. So obviously right now there's still transition to this new thing called the internet. Like we haven't really figured it out. We're still transitioning. A big problem with us is the news industry gave away content for free for so long that now it's hard to get people to subscribe. And then now there's so many other people where you can get it for free. We have 2 websites, which not everyone knows. HoustonChronicle.com is a paywall subscription website. That's like the print version, right? Like the print newspaper version goes there. And then there's Chron.com, which is the free one. And we have to because Chron.com gets so much more clicks and advertisers do better. And so it's like, it's been a long debate since I've been there about like trying to wean off Chron.com to HoustonChronicle.com for the subscriptions. And one of the things Annie and I were talking about is just like, you know, when Apollo 11 landed on the moon, it was big news. And then quickly, like it became less news and less news, right? Like you talk to so many people who don't even know we're going back to the moon. It's just like, it's like big news and it kind of quickly falls on the news cycle. That's just like gotten worse now. Your people's attention spans are so short. It still happens a lot. I would say I don't cover any commercial cargo launches at all just because it's not newsworthy anymore. SpaceX landing up right, not newsworthy anymore. It's more newsworthy if it crashes, right? Like, and so it's just interesting because you have to balance like what's new and what's important. And it's an interesting balance because obviously you want to keep providing all these like smaller updates, but you still want to get people that are interested in, which is why it's interesting to write about space now because there's just so many missions going on. Yeah, and because of the pandemic, that's been really difficult because everyone's still working remote in the newsroom. We haven't been, our company hasn't let us back in. And the Johnson Space Center hasn't let me down there but once. because of the pandemic. And so like I can't even get out there. And so that makes it hard. You know, I do a lot of virtual, a lot of remote calls and talks. And anytime I can get out there, I always like to get out in person and meet people and whatnot. But it's just an interesting time to be in journalism. But anyway, that's really all I have. I didn't have a question slide. So like, I'd love to know if you guys have any questions. I will repeat the questions and I will, give me a second, guys. I'm going to try and open the chat. I think there's already some questions here. I don't know if they're all for me. Okay, there are some questions here, but let's start with the ones in the audience. I'm going to read these over here, okay? I will repeat the questions. So, yes. Oh, yeah.
I'm running as an independent for Congress in the 38th district. I'm an electrical engineer. I say in my blogs that we need more engineers in the Congress and less lawyers and lawmakers. But I noticed that your editorial board endorsed Leslie Hunt in the Republican primary committee in a couple of weeks. And nowhere does he mention anything about space. I looked on his website and he has no policy for space. He wants to prioritize everything in 50 countries. Have you had a chance? I know that the Chronicle endorsed him without even a screen. So have you had a chance to interview or talk to some of these candidates about what their space policy will be? I have a very clear space policy of promoting autonomous and promoting fusion rockets for a Mars mission, which will get us there in a few days in the coming 10 to 20 years.
Okay, so the question is about our editorial board and if I have talked to any of them about space policy. Any of the candidates about space policy. So I'm going to disappoint you tremendously right now and tell you that they keep editorial board very separate from reporters. I can't even tell you who's on our editorial board. Okay, they're like 2 floors below us. That is the opinion section, and we're not allowed to have opinions. We're supposed to be neutral and unbiased. So I have had no hand in any of that, and I have not talked to any of the candidates. That's just not in my job capacity. The only time I reach out to political candidates is frankly when I'm writing an article that's a little political and I need like someone to weigh in on, you know, like what this means for Houston, if there's jobs created, jobs lost, stuff like that. So I have not talked to any of the candidates about space, and I have no insight into what kind of questions they ask. Just because, like, I also don't talk to advertising. They keep us very separate from advertising. They keep us very separate for editorial because they don't want, I know it's hard when you read the paper and you see editorials that are obviously opinionated, but they don't want us to have that same association. Like I'm supposed to be neutral and unbiased, and so they keep me very separate from those worlds. So I'm very sorry, but I don't have a good answer for that. Okay, I have a business cards. Anyone who wants it, and I can shoot you over to the correct people. It's just not me. Okay. Any other questions? Yes. All right, a Houston-based space company people might not know about that I find particularly interesting. So I actually just wrote about one that's pretty new. Lunar Resources. Have you guys heard of them? Yeah, they're very new, but they've gotten some grants from NASA and from the National Science Foundation. So that kind of makes me think that they're, you know, once you start getting money, it legitimizes it in my eyes, like to get venture capital or to get some kind of NASA grants. But they are building, they are working to make lunar, they're going to mine resources from the moon. And so they're building a reactor that will take the regolith, the soil of the moon, and it will heat it up to, I have to look at my article of everything exact now, but something like, it's hotter than molten lava, okay? Then we heat it up, and when you heat it up and you run electrical current through it, it breaks off the oxygen. So the oxygen bubbles up and that can be captured, and you'll use the oxygen for oxidizer, propellant, and for breathing, obviously, if you need to. But the main thing is propellant. Could be split into water. But then the different levels of metal underneath it. So, you know, like silicone, we talked about, you guys were talking about that earlier. You take out the silicone to make solar cells. You can take out iron for rebar. You could take out just different things that would allow them to build on the moon. And so the idea is we can't launch everything up there because it's so expensive. So we can use the regolith to make things on the moon. That would just save us a ton of money and make it more sustainable. And they also want to, they're working with what I thought was interesting is they're part of a study that would replace the Arecibo radio telescope that collapsed with one on the moon. And so they're working on building one on the dark side of the moon. They're part of like, they would mine the regolith to, you know, build the structure of the antenna, of the observatory. And so that one is something that's interesting to me, that's under the radar a little bit. Trying to think of it, because they're so new. There's another one that's working on building a supersonic plane. I'm going to blank on their name at the moment because I'm being put on the spot. I'm sorry, I'm not great at the recall. But there's someone building a supersonic plane here. That's cool. And obviously, I think y'all. No, that was not based in Houston. There's one based here in Houston that's doing it. They're not quite as far along as Boom. I think Boom's gotten farther along than this one. I think it's. No, my phone's over there. Okay, I'll have to pull it up. For some reason, I'm thinking Firefly Aerospace. I'm not sure that's right. But there's a company that they're working on doing point-to-point travel around the U.S. pretty quickly. But I'd say Lunar Resources is probably one of the ones I've met more recently. But a lot of people know about Axiom Space. It's building a commercial space station. And Intuitive Machines and NanoRacks. Those are kind of like the big players. And a lot of other ones are kind of suppliers. But I thought Lunar Resources was interesting. What other questions you got for me? Yeah.
I know a few years ago, I submitted an idea from did you know that we have several high schools in the Houston area that design and make equipment to be into that?
So did I know that there were high schools that design and create equipment for the International Space Station program? Is it more like payloads, like experiments, or is it more like?
No, it's a full program.
Uh-huh.
And they design equipment and send it up to the
What kind of equipment?
Everything from software, hardware, even equipment for installing batteries.
Cool. I did not know that. I'll follow up with you later. Hardware, software, batteries, that type of equipment is being made in high schools apparently here and sent to the ISS. So something else. I think you had your hand up here. Yes. I've covered the spaceport since I was a business reporter here. So I've been covering it for years. And I'm excited to see that there is groundbreaking happening. So I first started covering it. They're like, hey, we have a spaceport. Then it'd be another year. And they'd be like, we're building infrastructure. I'm like, ooh, sexy. We got roads, right? Like, it's kind of hard to get behind the spaceport there. But I'm really excited now that they've got 3 big tenants. They've got Axiom Space, Space Station 1. They've got Intuitive Machines, which was always there, but they're building a bigger one. And then Collins Aerospace is also building a headquarters. And they keep teasing me about more coming. So like they're optimistic now. And I think that now that they've got some momentum, I think it will help. And the main thing that is important to know about the spaceport is we're not going to have launches here. We're never going to have vertical launches here because it's surrounded by a big city. Maybe one day, like Virgin Galactic type horizontal launches, you know, maybe something to go horizontally, then launch vertically over the Gulf of Mexico. But we're just a long ways from that. So right now, the spaceport's really focused on being a hub for aerospace manufacturing, you know, bringing jobs, creating an industry. One of my next stories on my to-do list is the Edge Center is based there. And I've been wanting to do this for a while because now they're trying to train, train people who can work at these companies like trade school, or it's a community college, but it's still more of a trade than like a engineering degree. So you can work at these companies that are building the hardware and the manufacturing stuff. And I'm really excited to see how much Axiom Space actually does their building, because I know the modules are being made in Italy. And so, but they'll be like, I think like all the electronics stuff will be installed here. So I'll be really intrigued once Axiom Space gets up and running to see how much of that's happening here. And Intuitive Machines is already doing a lot of their hands-on stuff. It's cool to see all the 3D printers that these companies have now, because they make so many of their parts just with 3D printers here in Houston, which is just really cool to see that you don't have to, obviously it's the module, a lot of those times those do get shipped in from Italy. NanoRacks had theirs in Italy as well, but it's cool to see how much of like the engine parts you can make with a 3D printer now. So I'm excited to see the spaceport is like breaking ground and getting these companies in. It's been good momentum, I think. All right, I'm gonna check here real quick. Thank you, David, for repeating my question to Elon. You know, it's been actually really funny. I've had like tons of strangers reach out to me on Twitter and LinkedIn, being like, "Oh, sorry, great question. Like, good job." Like, it's not the impression I hope to make.
Yeah, so we were watching on the NSS watch party. We were watching on the NSS watch party.
Yeah, I know. I was like, oh, okay. I'm like, I don't usually get nervous, right? Like I talk to CEOs, bank CEOs, I did airlines forever. I talked to United Airlines CEO multiple times. Standing on that stupid box in a crowd of people, I was just like so nervous. And then of course he doesn't get my question. I'm like, oh my God. Oh God, please don't, please don't. Let me not rise to that level, please. The space meme, oh God. I usually like to, the best thing about being a print reporter is I can fly under the radar. Like you wouldn't pick me out of a crowd at a restaurant, right? Like I just don't put me in a meme. I'm sorry, Vito, that your audios are not working. I hope everyone else on this one can hear me. I think this one was before I started talking. Okay, are there any questions from the online chat that I'm not seeing? Just type them in or shout them out.
Yeah, I don't think those were for you. I think there were some other ones before you came on, but that's
okay.
That's all.
Cool. Yes.
I'd like to just make an observation, sort of a question.
Yeah.
It's Black History Month, so where would be the best place for a spaceport in Canada?
Okay, that question is Black History Month, and where would the best place for a spaceport in Africa be? I'm sorry, that is way outside my wheelhouse. I don't even know. Anyone else have thoughts on that? Because I don't have any.
A little bit south of not Nigeria, a little bit south of Uganda. But which side of the east coast? East side of the east. Okay, now, well, you can't
launch
from,
east.
you know, there's the shoulder on the west coast, like Benin, all those little African countries, Liberia, all the way over to Benin. You could launch directly south from any of those countries and you'd be able to get to that's where the continent would be on the equator, on the east coast. What country would that be? Venezuela. Somalia. No, Somalia is not on the equator. Somalia is just far north. It's just south of the southern tip of Uganda. But yeah, there is a country adjacent to that. I guess I'm trying to get people to think in a different way.
That was proposed in the IDC conference in 2019.
Nigeria actually has a space program, which is good, you know. But if Somalia were to be a spaceport, it would not be a failed country. It would be something that would be necessary for mankind, and that we would have, you know, we would focus resources and attention. Yeah, that's all. Yeah.
Oh, no, this is my wheelhouse. They're debating where to put a spaceport in Africa. Oh no, I mean, that's all I have. So I have business cards. Anyone come get one. I love hearing from readers. I love hearing what I should be covering, what I don't know about, what I can do better. So I'll got emails. Oh, we got opinions on that.
Have you heard anything? Rice University is active in like materials and stuff, and a lot of times that overflows into space. Have you heard anything from your contacts at Rice University about what they're doing?
I talked to them quite a bit mostly for like different policy stuff, but they one of my first articles I took to be was actually they have a club there that was building satellites. Yeah, like their own, CubeSats, like the small ones. And they launched it up, and they had hoped the satellite could test technology to remove debris in space or to address debris in space. I think it's actually more they're measuring the drag on it so that they could use that to better understand, like, getting things out of orbit and what. It's been 2 years, so my memory's a little foggy, but I remember that one really got my interest going and just like the debris in space. So they've got clubs who are doing stuff like that and launching things like that, and they've got a lot of different students involved. Okay, yes.
Somewhere inside the space station, they're basically building a large habitat.
It's on my radar.
Yeah. That'd be worth looking at.
So they're building a Mars habitat with a 3D printer in the Johnson Space Center. So the idea is that it's an analog, so people are going to live there for an entire year. They're going to give up a whole year to live inside the Johnson Space Center, which is kind of mind-boggling to me. I actually just reached out to them a few weeks ago, and I said, hey, I want to tour this facility before you put people in it. And then I want to kind of do like, media calls with the people while they're living in there. So I'm hoping I can get the media calls down. But they said late spring or early summer, they're going to have an event to the media where we can come out and see the facility. So hopefully, if okay.
There's a couple of bases, at least,
Yeah, but
it's
because
sort of
it was
resembling.
so expensive, they used a small country that had a college.
This year is the 60th anniversary of the speech at the Rice in September, where he went through the wide open.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll have to keep that on my radar for sure.
University has a great program of free talks.
Yeah, we attend them.
Yes.
I got a question. Have you spoken to Dr. Sonny White down at Johnson Space Center? He's in the NIAC group, the NASA Advanced Concepts. Yeah, Advanced Concepts group. He just put something online a couple of weeks ago about they were looking for something completely different. They got two metal plates very, very close together. Word for apparent effect or something. And they took a photograph of something that at the time they weren't sure what it was. Then they finally realized that it exhibits some of the characteristics of a warp field bubble.
Oh.
Very, very tiny. Nanometers across. And they're still investigating it, but he has written a scientific paper. It's been published in the
I'm gonna,
scientific
once I get my
journal.
phone on me, I'm gonna get that name from you guys to look that up. Yes.
Yeah, I have a journalism question.
Okay.
You're talking about we're going to cover launches of cargo craft in space. It wouldn't be very appealing to a lot of readers. But what if in those kind of articles you could explain what it would mean to transport goods and material from Earth to, say, Mars or the Moon, or even someplace in orbit around Earth? Because if you have personnel in those areas, in those places, they're going to need food, they're going to need medicine, they're going to need supplies.
Yeah.
What if you were to cover that and write something about it? What if you could write? What is the media then? What does it mean for us as human beings living in space to have the ability to transport cargo, especially if you're to develop more efficient spacecraft using efficient fuels like nuclear propulsion, and what that would mean for our ability to have this control over the universe?
Yeah. Okay. So the question was, I see a question here too. I'll get into that in 1 second. The question was, if I could use cargo launches just to talk more in general about the importance of getting cargo into like lunar orbit or to the moon, to Mars, into Earth's orbit, that type of thing. So the thing is, like, I usually tie those articles into different things because it's the cargo launches happen multiple times a year now. And so like sometimes if there's something interesting on it, I'll write about like the science that's on it. But I mean, if I were to do that for every article, it'd just still be the same, right? It'd be like 4 articles a year on like the importance of sending cargo to space, which at the same time, like, it's like, yeah, we know it's important, but like it's not used anymore. But I have tried to work that into other articles, like going to Mars, you know, how you'll have to get cargo there, not just people, and how you'll need multiple things. So that's the type of topic I tend to weave into bigger topics instead of making its own individual article.
But if you're designing together, what does it mean for us to get together with the space? And it's ease of goods transportation. How much of a convenience will it be for us?
But it wouldn't be a convenience if you leave Earth's orbit. Like the only time it's convenience if you're in the space station. Like on the moon, you can't really, it's not convenient. To Mars, cargo deliveries aren't convenient. So it's not like quite 1-to-1 unless we have much more advanced technology than we do now. It's not like I can send up a fresh orange or cold pizza. So like, it's just, I don't know if tying that to every commercial launch is really the way to go from a newsworthy perspective.
That's the idea. I'm not
Yeah.
talking about every commercial launch.
No. Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely something to look into. I agree with that. I'm sorry, I'm going to try this one real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. So the volume's not great.
There's
Okay,
a
so the
question.
discussion about repurposing ISS rather than deorbiting it. Is that on my radar? Boosting it to a high orbit and stabilizing it as a World Heritage Site. Oh. That is interesting, David. So David is asking if, you know, people are talking about deorbiting the ISS. I recently got sucked into the article because, you know, my editor started seeing the headlines. The ISS is going to plummet into the ocean in 2031. And I'm like, well, this isn't new, guys. It's going to be deorbited. I still had to write an article. So I like worked my butt off to try and make it a like non-clickbaity article, right? Like look into the station overall and the funding and whatnot. So that's been a big topic lately is what happens at the end of the space station's life because it becomes so old. David was saying, well, what if we boost it to a higher orbit and make it like a World Heritage Site where people could visit, you know, kind of like underwater, you know, I'm a scuba diver, so sometimes you can scuba down to like see these different statues and stuff. Like if you could travel there, I haven't looked into that. I can imagine money and is a big issue. Just like who's going to pay to keep it in space until enough people can afford to go visit it, because it's going to be a long time before most of us in this room probably will be able to afford going into space. Unless we win on those competitions, because billionaires for some reason love giving these competitions now, which I'm all about. You know, get yourself a ride, that's cool, but it's just so funny. Like, I feel like they can't go to space now without taking some people with them. But so like, I just don't know if there'll be a big enough audience to get up there to justify the cost. Also, I think the modules, the biggest concern is just that those core modules aren't going to be safe for much longer. And so I don't know, obviously I'm a room engineer, so I don't want to step out of my area, but I don't know that if we boost it to higher orbit, we can keep those modules safe for much longer without doing a lot of work that we still have the technology for at the moment. That's my thoughts on that. If someone has something more intelligent, you can let me know. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's probably about 5 new space right now.
Yeah, and that's a good point too, is just the fact that, just since you can't hear, that there's multiple countries involved. And so getting all of them to agree to keep paying that money instead of, you know, switching over to other endeavors in space.
Well, US is the biggest contributor.
Yeah.
Is they're not the only one against the decision.
And I mean, they need to free up the money to go to the moon and Artemis and stuff. There's just, you know, there's never enough money. Always a problem. My own life, right? Never enough money. But okay.
One last question.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
It seems like Richard Moore was kind of acceptable. Didn't have quite the same backlash. Or maybe you saw something that I didn't see.
You mean the backlash just in that narrative of like rich billionaires in space? Okay, so you're saying the Inspiration 4 orbit might not have had the same backlash of billionaires going into space. Probably because, you know, I think it still had some. I mean, they tried really hard to make it about charity, but I could also kind of tell like that was just like part of their shtick, which I mean is a great thing to do. They raised a lot of money and they got 3 people who wouldn't go to space otherwise. On a side note, I just read the article of that guy who couldn't go because he was too heavy. Oh my God. He was just like, did you see that as a weight restriction of 250? So one of the guys who got to go was gifted it to a friend who won the competition, and he wasn't allowed in the spacecraft because he didn't fit the seats and the restraints and it's a safety thing.
And the Associated Press just did an interview with this guy, like, can you imagine being at home, being like, I won this trip to space and I had to give it away. Oh God, that was a heartbreaking read for me. Yeah, it was because you can't, it was like 250 pounds and I think he was like 300 and SpaceX didn't have time for him to lose 50 pounds, you know, if it was like maybe 5 pounds, you could do a juice cleanse and get there, right? But like 50 pounds. But no, I don't think that one did get much backlash because they did take a bunch of other people with them. And I mean, it was just really the first time. I think the all civilian crew angle helped, which I wrote a fun article about, like, why do we call it civilian, right? Because technically everyone's a civilian, like how do you define civilian? But the all amateur crew kind of helps with that angle. And I think it's because, you know, they paid to go on and they didn't spend the money to develop it. I think Bezos gets a lot of criticism because he's like spent so much money to go to space instead of, I mean, I'm sure he, obviously him and his ex-wife give a lot of money here. And I know if you ever hear Elon Musk talk, he always says, I think 99% of our money should be spent on Earth. We need to address Earth first, but we can spend that 1% for the space. And so I you know, it's kind of hard with that backlog on that narrative. I have heard it a lot. I'm not sure if Inspiration 4 was as bad or not, but it was kind of a rambling answer. I apologize. And I'm staying away from that topic. Yes. So the question was if there's more high school students interested in like space careers and jobs. You know, in Houston, I think the people in the Clear Lake area have got this great like line there, and that's kind of always an interesting topic. If you talk to people in Clear Lake, NASA's always there. I feel like SpaceX has really rejuvenated a ton of interest in space. Like I think Elon Musk has made it sexy, right? He's made it exciting. Just the way he tests, right? Like he doesn't care that 40 satellites fell out of the sky. Oh, dang, you know, if NASA had done that, it'd be like a meltdown. And, you know, he tests these rockets in a way that, oh, look, another one exploded. Woohoo, the crater's in the right spot. Like, this is stuff he's doing. And so he's he's engaging. And when I was in Brownsville, I talked to multiple students who are really encouraged that they can get an engineering job and stay close to home now. And some of them have gotten internships there. I talked to one college where they worked with the students on a project where they had to create a weather balloon that would be able to like release itself, because it's like a 2-person job to put up a weather balloon. And so they wanted to free those 2 people up to do other things. And so they like challenged the students to create a weather balloon that would release itself and fill itself without needing to be hands-on. And so I do think that SpaceX has really gotten this next generation excited about it. And I think it's just part of Elon Musk's demeanor. You know, if you look at him on Twitter versus Jeff Bezos, if you go through his Instagram and Twitter, it's all like selfies. My company's doing this great thing, and here's what I'm doing next at Blue Origin. Well, SpaceX, like Elon Musk is kind of like shooting the shit with you. He's posting memes, like talking about Dogecoin, and the next thing you know is like rockets. And so he's a little more, obviously he's a billionaire, so he's not approachable, but he feels approachable. And then his company is just the fast pace of things, I do think has gotten more students and kids interested in it. I don't know if I've seen it a ton locally. I know that Clear Lake for sure has a good line there, and we're creating that program at the Spaceport to try and get more community college or just trade skills, because I know one of the reasons I wrote about this a long time ago. Blue Origin was thinking about building a rocket engine manufacturing facility at the Spaceport, but we lost to Huntsville, Alabama, partly because they have the workforce. They have the people who know how to build rockets, and we have human spaceflight. We don't have that expertise that's like readily available at the different levels, right? And so I know that's something that's a big focus of the city, is to try and keep building up as we attract more of these aerospace companies. And so that's something I'm gonna look into a little more, but it was really cool to see it in Brownsville, especially since, you know, just a few years ago, that community was labeled as one of the poorest in the country. That's not a label you want. And now they've got this really big company that's like having kids like wanting to go into engineering more and inspiring kids to get jobs there. So that's always cool. I'm sorry, I think I see questions here. Also, if I need to stop, just shush me out. Thank you, Tom. David, core modules don't have to be safe as long as they can be depressurized, uninhabited. Planning and executing the deorbit would also be expensive. Good points, David. I'll have to look into that more. I had not actually heard about making it a World Heritage Site before. It's the first I've heard about that topic. Any other? Yes. Yes.
Literally half a mile, quarter mile in Mexico.
Yes.
Have you gotten any reaction from, how does Mexico feel about having?
So in Boca Chica is like right across the river from Mexico. And so the question is if I've had reaction from how Mexico feels about it. To be honest, I haven't, but I've had several sources bring that up to me. I've had a couple sources be like, you know, we talk about, when we look at this from an environmental regulation from how it's affecting the US, but we haven't looked at it as to how it's affecting Mexico, and it's right there. And obviously that's a border community where people go back and forth a lot. And so I do think that is something that's being overlooked, and I have overlooked it as well. And so I don't have a good answer for how it is being perceived on the other side.
One thing I heard from my friends is already in Mexico. Is it on close to beaches?
Oh, if you go to Mexico, they don't close the beaches, so you can get closer to the launches in SpaceX. That's a pro tip right there. That is a pro tip. I'm like, I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to be, South Padre Island. Like, I was trying to figure that out. Well, thank you guys. Like I said, please come grab a business card. I want tips, just friendly emails. I have a couple people I just talk to randomly, so it has been nice to meet everybody. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. Everybody lined up over there. Thank you all online. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the online bit. So thank you all, and see you all later. Bye.
See you next time.